Do you ever wonder about the breakfasts your African American parents never taught you and why they disappeared? These breakfasts once set the rhythm of the morning, grounding families before the day began. What slipped away with them that we never realized mattered? Fried cornmeal mush with syrup was one of those breakfasts that quietly carried families through the hardest decades, long before boxed cereal took over the mornings. A pot of mush would be cooked and thickened the night before because nothing could go to waste, and cornmeal was one of the cheapest staples you could rely on. By sunrise, it would be firm enough to slice, each piece hitting the skillet with that gentle hiss that meant breakfast was truly beginning. The outside browned until crisp, while the inside stayed soft, warm, and steady, making every bite feel both hearty and familiar. When syrup was poured over those golden slices, it turned the humble dish into something sweet and comforting, the kind of sweetness that did not need to be fancy to feel special. Grandparents made this because it filled bellies, stretched ingredients, and tasted like something far richer than it really was. Children did not think about thrift or struggle, they just knew it tasted like love served on a plate. Fried mush might look simple today, but its roots run deep in memory, in resilience, in the way older generations held families together one skillet breakfast at a time. Even now, one bite brings back chilly mornings, warm kitchens, and the soft scrape of a metal spatula flipping a slice just right. Rice and raisins with butter was the kind of breakfast that felt like a treat, even though it came from the most basic pantry ingredients a household always had on hand. Long before sugary cereal brands took over the shelves, many families started their day with a warm bowl of rice simmered until soft and mixed with sweet raisins that plumped in the heat. A pat of butter melted over the top, coating each grain and adding richness that made the dish feel far more indulgent than its low cost suggested. It was warm, steady, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that felt like a hug before school or chores. Grandparents made it because rice was cheap, raisins lasted forever in a jar, and butter brought everything together in a way that tasted wholesome and familiar. Some added a sprinkle of sugar, others a dash of cinnamon, but most kept it simple, letting the steam rise like a quiet morning ritual. The flavor was gentle, the sweetness mild, and the bowl always seemed to disappear faster than expected. For many families, this dish was tied to winter mornings, cold floors, and the feeling of being cared for before the day even started. Even today, people who grew up with rice and raisins remember the way it filled the house with warmth and made them feel ready for anything. Hot water cornbread breakfast cakes were the quick morning version of a beloved staple that had already lived lifetimes in African American kitchens. A bowl of cornmeal mixed with boiling water created a dough that came together almost instantly, proving that good food did not need complicated steps or expensive supplies. Grandparents shaped the dough with their hands, patting each cake gently before laying it into the skillet where it sizzled and tightened into a crisp golden edge. These smaller breakfast cakes were eaten warm, often with a smear of jam, a drizzle of honey, or just a little butter melting across the top. The texture was dense but soft, hearty but still light enough to enjoy early in the morning. It tasted like home, like tradition, like something passed down not through written recipes but through practiced hands that knew exactly how the batter should feel. These cakes made mornings easier, faster, and far more delicious than anyone expected from such simple ingredients. Children loved them because they felt like little treats, bite-sized comforts that fit perfectly into small hands. Adults loved them because they stretched the pantry and kept everyone fed without fuss or cost. Hot water cornbread breakfast cakes were proof that a skillet, some cornmeal, and a steady hand could create something unforgettable day after day. Molasses biscuits were one of those breakfasts that felt both humble and rich, depending entirely on the memory you brought to the table. The biscuits themselves were simple, mixed from flour, fat, and whatever milk or water could be spared, but it was the molasses brushed over the top that made them special. The dark sweetness soaked into the warm bread, giving each bite a deep flavor that felt like comfort stretching back generations. Grandparents baked these because molasses was cheap, shelf-stable, and full of the kind of sweetness that made children smile even when times were tight. The smell alone could bring the whole household into the kitchen, filling the air with something warm and grounding. Some families served them with butter, letting it melt into every crack, while others ate them plain, enjoying the caramel-like richness all on its own. These biscuits were not fancy, but they tasted like care, like effort, like mornings where love was baked into every crumb. They were the kind of breakfast that lingered in your memory long after the plate was empty, reminding you of kitchens where nothing was wasted and everything was shared. Fried fatback with biscuits was the kind of breakfast that came from deep tradition, from years when every part of the animal was used and nothing was taken for granted. Before bacon became the breakfast standard, fatback was the salty, sizzling star of the morning. Grandparents sliced it thick and fried it until the edges crisped and curled, releasing a savory aroma that filled the whole house. The drippings soaked into fresh biscuits, turning them into something rich and flavorful without needing butter or gravy. The combination was simple but powerful. A pairing that carried families through long days of labor, and school fatback was inexpensive, accessible, and packed with flavor, which made it a natural choice for rural homes and city kitchens alike. Children grew up associating that salty crunch with mornings spent around crowded tables, hands reaching for biscuits still warm from the oven. Even though fatback is rarely seen in modern breakfast routines, the memory of it remains strong for those who grew up with its bold taste. It represents a time when meals came from resourcefulness, from tradition, and from knowing how to make the most of what you had. Stewed apples over grits was the quiet morning comfort many families turned to when fresh fruit was limited, but preserved apples were always within reach. Grandparents would slice apples thin and let them simmer with sugar or syrup until they softened into a fragrant golden mixture that tasted like fall in every season. Meanwhile, a pot of grits bubbled on the stove, thickening slowly as it absorbed the heat. When the stewed apples were spooned over the top, the contrast of creamy grits and sweet fruit felt like a small luxury. It was warm, filling, and gentle, the kind of breakfast that soothed the stomach and the spirit. Some families added cinnamon, others added butter, but most kept it simple because the apples were already sweet enough. This dish was a reminder of home orchards, backyard trees, and jars of preserves lined up on pantry shelves. It tasted like patience and tradition, like the kind of mornings where time moved slower. Even today, stewed apples over grits feels like a forgotten treasure from a quieter time. Fried salmon patties for breakfast might seem unusual today, but for many African American families in the 60s and 70s, canned salmon was a dependable pantry staple that worked for any meal of the day. Grandparents mixed the salmon with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasoning, shaping it into patties that sizzled in the skillet until crisp. The smell filled the kitchen with something hearty and inviting, a bold start to the morning that made you feel ready for whatever the day demanded. Served with grits or biscuits, the patties tasted rich and satisfying, proof that canned ingredients could create meals full of flavor and comfort. Salmon was not expensive, but it felt special, which made breakfast feel special too. Children grew used to that savory taste long before they ever tried a restaurant version. Fried salmon patties were practical, filling, and unforgettable, a reminder of how creativity in the kitchen shaped so many childhood mornings. Egg and rice bowls were one of those fast, dependable breakfasts grandparents made without thinking, because the ingredients were always there and the result was always good. A pot of rice from last night could be rewarmed with a pat of butter, turning it soft and fragrant again. Then came the egg, fried or scrambled, laid gently over the top like a finishing touch. Only older hands knew how to time perfectly. The yolk soaked into the rice or the scrambled bits mixed through, creating a bowl that tasted warm, mild, and deeply comforting. It was cheap, quick, and endlessly reliable, the kind of breakfast that made mornings feel steady. Families loved it because nothing went to waste, because rice could stretch farther than any box of cereal ever could. Egg and rice bowls tasted like routine, like care, like the kind of quiet morning love that came before the sun was fully up. How cakes with butter and sugar were the sweet breakfast treat that felt almost like dessert, even though they came from the simplest ingredients in the pantry. Made from cornmeal batter poured onto a hot skillet, each cake sizzled as it spread, forming a crisp edge and soft center that tasted perfect every single time grandparents would flip them with practiced ease, stacking them high and spreading butter that melted instantly into the warm surface. A sprinkle of sugar added just enough sweetness to make the hoe cakes feel like a special morning indulgence. They were quick, affordable, and comforting. The kind of food that made children sit down fast and quiet at the table. Hoe cakes were history and home all at once, a dish born from necessity that became a beloved tradition. Even now, the memory of that buttery sweetness lingers in the minds of anyone lucky enough to grow up with them. Sorghum syrup on hot biscuits was a rural breakfast tradition rooted in the fields and farms where sorghum was grown and milled long before maple syrup ever became common. The syrup was thick, earthy, and rich, with a sweetness that felt deeper than sugar. Grandparents would split open hot biscuits, steam rising, and drizzle sorghum across the soft center until it glistened. The flavor was bold and comforting, slightly smoky, and entirely unique. It tasted like the land itself, like seasons of harvest and the steady work of hands that knew how to make every ingredient count. Biscuits with sorghum were inexpensive, filling, and quietly indulgent in their own rustic way. Families loved them because the syrup lasted long, cost little, and carried the taste of home. Even today, those who grew up with sorghum syrup remember its distinct sweetness with a kind of affection that never fades. Cornbread and buttermilk cups were the kind of breakfast that felt both rustic and comforting, the sort of meal grandparents made without measuring or fuss because they had been doing it their whole lives. Leftover cornbread never went to waste, not when it could be crumbled into a bowl and soaked in cold buttermilk until the pieces softened but kept just enough texture to make each bite interesting. The tang of the buttermilk balanced the slight sweetness of the cornbread, creating a flavor that felt simple yet deeply satisfying. Some families added a spoonful of sugar, others preferred it plain, but either way, it tasted like something honest and nourishing. It was a breakfast built for long days, a quick way to fill stomachs without spending money or time. Children who grew up on it remember the chilly shock of the buttermilk, the softness of the crumbs, and the quiet pleasure of eating something that required no stove at all. It tasted like tradition handed down through memory rather than recipes, a meal tied to rural kitchens, hardworking families, and morning routines shaped by practicality. Even today, people who try it for the first time often describe it as unexpectedly comforting, like discovering a forgotten piece of their own history. Cornbread and buttermilk cups might seem humble, but in the hands of grandparents, they became something far richer than the ingredients suggested. Coffee milk for kids was one of those small morning rituals that made children feel grown, even though the drink was mostly warm milk with only a tiny splash of coffee. Parents and grandparents mixed it carefully, just enough coffee to tint the milk a light tan and add the faintest whisper of that roasted smell adults relied on to start their day. It was soothing, warm, and familiar. The kind of drink that made sleepy children perk up before school without giving them the full strength of adult coffee. Many African-American households use this as a way to include children in the morning rhythm, letting them feel part of the adult world while still keeping things gentle. The taste was mild and slightly sweet, especially when a bit of sugar was added, and it had a comforting creaminess that stuck with you long after the cup was empty. The mornings felt quieter back then, slower, filled with the soft sounds of spoons stirring and radios humming low in the background. Coffee milk was not just a drink, it was a moment, a shared start to the day that made you feel loved and included. Even now, the memory of that warm cup brings people back to kitchens filled with steam, conversation, and the steady comfort of family. Salt pork gravy over bread was one of those breakfasts created from necessity, yet it tasted like something that belonged in a country diner. Grandparents would fry slices of salt pork until the fat rendered out and the meat crisped, releasing a savory aroma that meant a hearty meal was on the way. The drippings were whisked with flour and milk to create a thick, salty gravy that clung to the spoon, rich and filling despite its humble ingredients, Poured over toast or biscuits, it transformed simple bread into something warm and deeply satisfying. This was a breakfast made for long days and empty pockets, a way to stretch flavor as far as it could go. Children did not think about thrift. They just knew the gravy tasted good and made the morning feel special. The saltiness, the creaminess, and the soft bread soaking up every drop created a combination that lingered in both taste and memory. It was the kind of meal that carried families through tough times and still managed to feel generous. Even today, people who grew up with salt pork gravy remember it with a fondness that nothing else can quite match. Scrapple slices were one of the most resourceful breakfasts older generations relied on, especially in regions where nothing from the pig went to waste. Scrapple mixed pork scraps with cornmeal and spices, forming a loaf that could be sliced and fried until crisp on the outside and soft on the inside. Grandparents cooked it in a hot skillet, letting each piece form that perfect golden crust that crackled slightly under the fork. It was savory, hearty, and deeply rooted in tradition, a dish born from the idea that every ingredient had value. Some families ate it plain, others added syrup or mustard, but no matter how it was served, Scrapple had a distinctive flavor that stayed with you. It tasted like farm mornings, like smoke rising from cast iron pans, like a time when food came from skill rather than convenience. Children might turn up their noses at the idea today, but to those who grew up on it, Scrapple was a breakfast that meant strength, thrift, and the comfort of knowing a meal would always be there. Even now, the memory of that sizzling sound brings people back to early mornings in small kitchens where tradition guided the skillet. Fried bologna biscuits were the kind of breakfast that made you feel like you were getting something special even when money was tight. Grandparents would slice thick rounds of bologna and lay them into a popping skillet, letting the edges curl and brown until the flavor deepened into something smoky and rich. The hot slices were tucked into fresh biscuits, often homemade or leftover from the night before, absorbing just enough of the bologna's warmth to soften perfectly. It was salty, savory, and incredibly satisfying, the kind of handheld breakfast that felt almost luxurious despite coming from inexpensive ingredients. Children loved the way the biscuit crumbled slightly with each bite, mixing with the bold taste of the fried bologna. Adults appreciated how easy it was to make and how far it could stretch the budget. This was the kind of food that reminded families that good meals did not need fancy ingredients or long cooking times. All they needed was a skillet, some biscuits, and someone who knew how to make simple food feel unforgettable. Country sausage patties with cane syrup were a sweet and savory breakfast that carried the flavor of Southern tradition. Grandparents often made sausage from scratch or bought it fresh, shaping it into patties with practiced hands. The patties sizzled in the skillet, filling the house with a smell that meant the day was off to a strong start. Once cooked, they were served alongside cane syrup, thick and dark, ready for dipping or drizzling. The combination of salty sausage and sweet syrup created a harmony that felt indulgent even when the ingredients were simple. It stuck to your ribs, kept you full, and tasted like a morning wrapped in warmth. Cane syrup was cheaper and easier to find than maple syrup, but it had a bold flavor all its own. Families passed down the preference across generations, pairing it with biscuits, sausage, and sometimes even eggs. Country sausage patties with cane syrup were more than breakfast. They were the memory of Sunday mornings, crowded tables, and laughter rising like steam from the skillet. Leftover fish and grits were a breakfast that turned yesterday's dinner into something new and comforting. Grandparents knew better than to waste good fried fish, and reheating it in the morning gave the house a rich, savory smell that made everyone wander toward the kitchen. The fish was warmed gently, keeping the crust crisp, then served alongside a bowl of buttery grits that balanced the strong flavor with something soft and smooth. It was a combination rooted in coastal and southern traditions, where fish was common and grits were always waiting in the pantry. Children grew up thinking nothing of fish for breakfast, tasting the salty crunch next to the warm creaminess of the grits. It was hearty, practical, and filling, the kind of breakfast that made you ready for a full day's work or school. Even today, One bite can transport people back to kitchens where cast iron pans never cooled and breakfast tasted like the continuation of joy from the night before. Butter sugar toast was the quick, sweet breakfast many children rushed toward before school, made from nothing more than bread, butter, and a sprinkle of sugar. Grandparents spread the butter all the way to the edges, making sure every bite would melt just right. The toast warmed the sugar until it softened slightly, creating a delicate crunch that felt almost like a treat. It was simple, fast, and inexpensive, yet it tasted like something far more indulgent. For many children, this was the breakfast they could hold in one hand while tying their shoes with the other. It tasted like busy mornings, like running out the door with crumbs on your shirt, like the gentle love of someone who wanted you fed. Even when there was no time, butter sugar toast may be overlooked today, but the memory of it still lingers for anyone who grew up on its warm sweetness. Potato cakes from leftover mash were the kind of breakfast that proved nothing in the kitchen ever had to be thrown away. Grandparents mixed cold mashed potatoes with flour or cornmeal, shaping the mixture into patties that fried beautifully in a hot skillet. The outside crisped into a golden crust, while the inside stayed soft, warm, and comforting. It was a thrifty breakfast that used leftovers creatively and fed everyone well without costing anything extra. The cakes were often served plain, sometimes with syrup, and sometimes with butter melting across the top. They tasted like resourcefulness, like making the most of what you had, like the kind of wisdom passed down quietly from generation to generation. Even today, people remember those potato cakes as a breakfast that felt both humble and full of heart. Cracklin biscuits were a breakfast born from tradition, from kitchens where pork cracklings were saved and treasured because they added flavor nothing else could match. Mixed into biscuit dough, the cracklings melted slightly as the biscuits baked, releasing savory richness into every bite. Grandparents made these biscuits with steady hands and an understanding of how to stretch ingredients while still creating something deeply satisfying. The result was warm, crumbly, and full of flavor, a biscuit that needed no butter or jam to taste complete. It was the kind of breakfast that connected families to their heritage, to moments when nothing went to waste and everything had a purpose. Children often loved the surprising crunch, not realizing it came from a history of thrift and creativity. Cracklin biscuits remain a powerful memory for many, a taste of home that has the strength of generations behind it. Canned mackerel with eggs was one of those breakfasts that filled the house with a smell you never forgot, bold and rich, the kind of scent that told you someone was cooking with purpose. Grandparents used canned mackerel because it was inexpensive, packed with protein, and always waiting in the pantry when fresh meat was not an option. They would open the can, drain the fish, and flake it into a skillet with onions or peppers if they had them. Then came the eggs, cracked right over the fish and stirred until everything blended into a savory scramble that tasted far more filling than it looked. It was a hard-working breakfast, meant to fuel long days, and it carried a flavor that felt deeply tied to the kitchens of older generations. Children growing up on it did not always understand how thrifty it was, only that it tasted warm, smoky, and strangely comforting. First thing in the morning, the mackerel gave the dish a richness, the eggs softened it, and together they made something cheap but unforgettable. Even today, people who grew up with canned mackerel and eggs describe it as a meal that tasted like family resourcefulness at its finest. It was a reminder that nourishing food did not need to be fancy to be good. Sweet rice fritters were one of those breakfasts that felt both like a treat and a solution, transforming leftover rice into something golden and warm that children loved. Grandparents would mix cold rice with sugar, flour, and sometimes a splash of milk or vanilla, forming the mixture into little patties that held together just enough to hit the skillet. As they fried, the edges crisped and the centers stayed soft, turning the rice into something closer to a sweet cake than a leftover. The sound of them sizzling in the pan was enough to wake the house, carrying a smell that felt gentle and inviting. These fritters cost almost nothing, yet somehow tasted like more effort had gone into them than the morning allowed. Served plain, dusted with sugar or drizzled with syrup, They were a breakfast that made children feel like they were being spoiled even though they came from last night's dinner. They were warm, soft, and just sweet enough to feel special. Sweet rice fritters were proof that older generations knew how to create comfort from whatever they had on hand. Banana bread pudding cups were one of the most clever ways grandparents reused stale bread, turning dryness into softness and waste into warmth. They mashed ripe bananas into the bread with milk, sugar, and a bit of spice if it was available, folding everything together until the mixture became thick and custard-like, scooped into small baking dishes or muffin tins. The cups baked into soft, fragrant servings that filled the entire kitchen with the smell of banana and browned bread. It was breakfast that tasted like dessert, but no one ever complained. The bananas added sweetness and moisture, stretching the ingredients into something filling and gentle on the stomach. Grandparents made these cups because they could not bear to throw out bread and because they knew how to turn limitations into something delicious. Children loved the warm centers and the slightly crisp tops, not realizing the whole breakfast was built from leftovers. Banana bread pudding cups were a quiet victory in the kitchen, a reminder that thrift could still bring joy. Butter-fried cornbread slices were the kind of breakfast that made you sit up a little straighter just from the smell alone. Leftover cornbread never went to waste, especially not when a skillet and a bit of butter could transform it into something golden, crisp, and wonderfully indulgent. Grandparents sliced the cornbread thick, letting the butter melt across the hot pan before laying each piece down to brown. The edges crisped quickly, creating a contrast to the soft center that felt almost like cake without the sweetness. Some families ate it plain, others added syrup or honey, and some sprinkled sugar over the top, but every version tasted rich and deeply satisfying. This was breakfast that reminded you of cast-iron skillets, warm kitchens, and mornings that started long before the sun rose high. Butter-fried cornbread slices were a way to stretch yesterday's food into today's comfort. Hominy with butter and pepper was the kind of breakfast that lived quietly in the background of many households, long before grits became the default choice. Hominy had a soft bite and a mild flavor that absorbed butter beautifully, turning each spoonful into something warm and soothing. Grandparents would heat it in a pot, stirring in butter until it melted completely, then add black pepper to give it depth and warmth. It was simple, inexpensive, and filling, the kind of breakfast made for mornings when the body needed steady fuel more than excitement. Children often ate it without thinking much about it, unaware that it connected them to older food traditions that stretched back generations. Hominy was a reminder of how African American families made the most of staple ingredients, honoring older methods while building new routines bowl after bowl. It offered comfort that lasted far longer than the meal itself. Peanut butter and corn syrup sandwiches were the kind of breakfast you could throw together in seconds. A heavy, sticky, sweet combination that kept kids full for hours. Grandparents spread thick peanut butter on soft sandwich bread and drizzled corn syrup over it, letting the syrup sink into the peanut butter until the whole thing clung together in a dense, satisfying bite. It was quick, cheap, and strong enough to carry a child through school mornings when there was no time for hot food. The sweetness blended with the saltiness of the peanut butter, creating a flavor that felt indulgent even though it came from pantry staples. Working households relied on this breakfast because it was dependable, affordable, and guaranteed to quiet hunger. Children loved its candy-like richness, even if the adults knew it was simply the best option available. Peanut butter and corn syrup sandwiches were a reminder of mornings shaped by love, necessity, and whatever ingredients were within reach. Fried chicken necks for breakfast were a testament to how nothing was wasted in older kitchens, especially in families that understood the value of every part of the bird. Chicken necks were seasoned, dredged, and fried just like larger cuts, producing crisp skin and tender meat that pulled away easily. Grandparents cooked them with a practiced hand, turning a frugal piece of meat into a flavorful start to the morning. Served alongside biscuits, grits, or even eaten alone, they tasted rich, savory, and far more satisfying than their humble appearance suggested. For children, it was a breakfast full of flavor and adventure, a reminder that good food did not have to be fancy or expensive. Fried chicken necks were a celebration of resourcefulness, tradition, and respect for the animal that fed the family. Sauteed onions and eggs were a simple breakfast that leaned on pantry staples when meat was scarce or too costly. Grandparents sliced onions thin and cooked them slowly until they softened and browned, releasing their sweetness into the skillet. Then came the eggs, cracked right over the top and scrambled gently so the onions intertwined with every bite. The result was savory, aromatic, and surprisingly comforting. This was working-class fuel, a breakfast that tasted far richer than its ingredients implied children might not have asked for it. But once the onions and eggs were on the plate, the flavor spoke for itself. It was warm, filling, and quietly satisfying, the kind of meal that taught you how to appreciate the depth hidden in simple ingredients. Sauteed onions and eggs were proof that good cooking came from skill, not expense. White corn grits with cheese scraps were nothing like the modern cheese grits you see today. These bowls were built from leftover ends of block cheese, the parts that were too small to slice but too valuable to waste. Grandparents grated or chopped the scraps into grits, letting the heat melt them slowly until tiny pockets of cheese appeared throughout the bowl. The flavor was mild, salty, and comforting, made richer by the knowledge that nothing had been thrown away. Children stirred their spoons through the steaming grits, hitting small bursts of melted cheese that tasted like little surprises. It was a breakfast that felt warm, practical, and full of memory, rooted in kitchens where thrift and creativity worked hand in hand. Sweetened cornflake fritters were one of the quirkiest breakfasts to come out of mid-century kitchens, a playful mix of crushed cornflakes, beaten egg, and a bit of sugar fried like pancakes. Grandparents stirred the ingredients together until the mixture clumped, then dropped spoonfuls into a hot skillet, flattening them gently so they crisped around the edges. They were sweet, crunchy, and warm, the kind of breakfast children loved because it felt fun and different from anything else served during the week. The fritters browned quickly, giving them a toasty flavor that paired well with syrup or powdered sugar. They were inexpensive, easy to make, and a clever way to use the bottom crumbs of a cereal box. Sweetened cornflake fritters tasted like creativity, like Saturday mornings, and like the joy grandparents found in making something simple feel magical. Stewed prunes and citrus offered a naturally sweet and nourishing side that fit perfectly with the back-to-nature movement of the 1970s. Dried prunes were simmered gently in water with slices of orange or lemon until they softened into a rich compote. A touch of cinnamon or clove added warmth, and the citrus brightened the deep, earthy flavor of the fruit. This dish required little sugar because the natural sweetness of the prunes intensified as they cooked, creating a syrupy juice that tasted indulgent yet wholesome. Served warm over oatmeal, alongside biscuits, or even chilled with yogurt, it provided fiber and essential vitamins that families valued. African-American households embraced it for both its practicality and comfort, turning an inexpensive ingredient into something special. Stewed prunes and citrus stood as a testament to mindful cooking, where a simple pot of fruit could deliver nutrition and quiet pleasure, reminding everyone that breakfast could be as healthful as it was delicious without any extravagant ingredients or effort. Hominy pancakes were another clever way families stretched resources into filling meals. Hominy, boiled corn kernels treated with lye, was folded into simple flour batter and fried on a hot griddle until crisp on the edges. The result was a pancake that was hearty, chewy, and rich in flavor. Families leaned on this dish because hominy was inexpensive, filling, and often available in bulk. These pancakes were served plain or topped with syrup, molasses, or even just butter when sugar was scarce. Children enjoyed the slightly nutty texture, while adults appreciated that it carried them through long hours of work. Hominy pancakes were tied to heritage too, with roots reaching back to Native American food traditions that influenced Southern cooking. They were a reminder of resilience and cultural continuity, showing how simple staples could be reinvented to meet new needs. Hominy pancakes filled stomachs, but they also filled mornings with the comfort of tradition and the creativity of making do. Collard green sandwiches were a resourceful way to fill plates when meat was out of reach. Cooked greens, seasoned with fatback or drippings if available, were pressed between slices of cornbread to make a humble but hearty meal. This simple sandwich was portable, filling, and affordable, making it a dependable choice for families stretched thin by segregation and poverty. Children carried them to school or work in lunch pails, where they stood as proof of both ingenuity and resilience. Housewives leaned on collards because they grew well, even in poor soil, and cornbread was a staple in every kitchen. Together, they created something greater than their parts, nourishing bodies and spirits alike. These sandwiches were not glamorous, but they filled stomachs and carried families through hard days. Though rarely remembered now, collard green sandwiches once reflected a culture of survival, turning two of the humblest foods into a powerful statement of endurance and self-reliance against every hardship imposed. Fried bologna sandwiches were born from necessity, but remembered for love. Thick slices of bologna hit a hot skillet and curled at the edges, sizzling in their own fat until browned and crisp. A fried egg or a slice of cheese might join the sandwich if luck allowed, but even plain, it was perfection. Served between two pieces of soft white bread or a biscuit, it was salty, savory, and satisfying. This was the kind of breakfast that did not apologize for being simple. It was fuel for long days, a way to stretch a few cents into something hearty. Children carried them in brown paper bags, while adults grabbed one before heading out to work. The smell of frying bologna filled the house, and even the neighbors could tell breakfast was ready. It was a reminder that good food did not have to be fancy. It only had to be made with care. For many families, this humble sandwich was a badge of resilience, the proof that they could make something delicious out of whatever they had. Molasses oatmeal filled kitchens with the deep aroma of blackstrap sweetness, offering an iron-rich start that was both frugal and indulgent. Old-fashioned oats simmered slowly in milk or water until creamy, then received a generous spoonful of thick sorghum or blackstrap molasses. The dark syrup melted into the oats, tinting them a warm brown and adding a flavor both smoky and sweet. Many families used molasses not only for its taste, but also for its mineral strength, a natural source of iron and energy. Some sprinkled chopped nuts or sliced bananas on top for extra texture, while others added a pinch of cinnamon for gentle spice. Molasses oatmeal spoke to a time when nourishment and economy were equally important, turning a humble grain into a breakfast that felt rich and sustaining. It remained a quiet favorite of African American households, a reminder that even the simplest bowls could carry history, health, and the comforting weight of tradition with every spoonful. Hog jowl and eggs was a breakfast that appeared especially around holidays, but its flavor and memory carried into everyday life. Hog jowl, a fatty cut of pork, was cheap and easy to find, especially in rural southern communities. Sliced thin and fried in skillets, it released rich fat that flavored the eggs cooked alongside it. Families treasured this dish when it appeared, because it added luxury to otherwise plain meals. It symbolized celebration, but it also reflected practicality, since hog jowl was inexpensive compared to other pork cuts. During the civil rights era, it fueled mornings with sustenance and comfort, giving families strength for long days ahead. Hog jowl and eggs represented both tradition and resilience, showing how households could enjoy moments of abundance even when times were lean. The dish was not only food, but a reminder of family gatherings, warmth, and the power of making the most of overlooked cuts. Mustard green stew was a bitter yet nourishing dish that carried families through hard seasons, simmered slowly with fatback or drippings to soften the strong taste. These greens were one of the most dependable crops in the South, thriving in poor soil and often lasting through the cooler months when other vegetables had failed. Housewives would cook large pots of mustard greens, letting them stew for hours until tender, often serving them with cornbread on the side to soak up the flavorful potlikker. Children did not always love the taste, but they ate it because it filled their stomachs and offered vitamins they badly needed. The bitterness reminded people of the harsh times they were enduring, yet the comfort of the warm stew reminded them of the strength in their communities. It was not fancy or celebrated, but it became a dish of survival, passed from one generation to the next. Mustard green stew stood as proof that even in scarcity, the land still gave enough to keep people going through Jim Crow hardships. Hot grits with butter and salt were the backbone of countless Southern mornings, a dish so simple yet so sacred that no table felt complete without it. Made from ground hominy simmered until smooth, grits were the definition of patience rewarded. They needed time, stirring, and a steady hand to reach the perfect texture. Not too thick, not too thin, just creamy enough to coat a spoon. A pat of butter on top melted into golden swirls, and a pinch of salt brought everything to life. This was food made for strength, for those who worked in fields, factories, or kitchens from dawn to dusk. It was nourishment that filled the belly and steadied the spirit. Children learned early how to stir the pot, to keep the grits from clumping, to treat the meal with the respect it deserved. Some added milk, some cheese, some even sugar, but pure grits with butter and salt needed nothing more. It was more than breakfast. It was a ritual of care and endurance. In a world that moved fast, this bowl forced you to slow down and savor the quiet. Catfish and grits gave weekend mornings a soulful edge, pairing crisp fried fish with creamy stone-ground grits in a combination that felt both rustic and celebratory. Fresh river catfish fillets were seasoned with salt, pepper, and a dusting of cornmeal before sliding into hot oil where they sizzled to a golden brown. The grits simmered slowly on the stove, enriched with butter and a touch of cream for a silky texture that balanced the crunch of the fish. Families often gathered around big skillets of catfish on Sundays after church, turning breakfast into a communal event. Some added a squeeze of lemon or a dash of hot sauce to brighten the flavors, while others served sliced tomatoes or greens on the side. Catfish and grits carried the heritage of Southern waterways and the ingenuity of African-American cooks who transformed local catches into a beloved morning feast that satisfied hunger and celebrated the bounty of rivers and farms alike. Molasses cornmeal custard was a dish that offered sweetness and substance while depending only on pantry staples. Families baked it by whisking cornmeal, milk, eggs when available, and molasses into a smooth mixture that thickened into a soft pudding in the oven. It was inexpensive to prepare, but filling enough to feed a household, making it a beloved breakfast or after-supper treat. The flavor was earthy and rich, with the deep sweetness of molasses carrying through each bite. Children often looked forward to it as a rare indulgence in households where desserts were not common. Adults valued it for its practicality, since it used cheap ingredients that could stretch for days. Molasses cornmeal custard represented thrift, but it also carried warmth and a sense of care, showing how families turned necessities into moments of comfort. It became part of the memory of kitchens during times of struggle, a dish that balanced scarcity with sweetness. Sorrel drink, influenced by Jamaican traditions, was made by steeping hibiscus leaves into a tart, refreshing beverage that carried cultural roots as well as survival value. Families brewed it during the hot months, sweetening it with sugar or molasses when possible. The drink was bright red, tangy, and cooling, offering relief after long days of work. For many, it connected them to a heritage that stretched back across the Atlantic, a reminder of resilience and identity in the face of oppression. Children drank it with joy, while adults valued its vitamins and refreshing qualities. The drink symbolized resourcefulness. Since hibiscus could be grown or foraged cheaply, it also showed how cultural traditions endured even under the harsh restrictions of segregation. Sorrel drink was not just refreshment, it was continuity, proof that survival included preserving roots as much as feeding bodies. Though less common now, it remains a reminder of how culture traveled, adapted, and survived in the kitchens of the Jim Crow South. Fried cornmeal cakes were the working man's pancakes, crisp at the edges, tender in the middle, and made from the same cornmeal that showed up at every Southern table. Mixed with milk, eggs, and a little salt, the batter went into a hot skillet and came out golden and bubbling. They could be eaten plain or drizzled with syrup, honey, or even a little molasses, depending on what was in the pantry. The smell of frying cornmeal was unmistakable, sweet and nutty, a scent that meant comfort was close. These cakes filled stomachs and hearts alike, simple enough for every day but special enough to remember. They were the breakfast of farmers, laborers, and children who learned that love came in humble servings. Fried cornmeal cakes didn't just feed, they fortified, reminding everyone that a good day started with something made by hand. Cornmeal. Hoe cakes with honey butter sizzled on griddles across the South, offering a thin and crispy alternative to traditional pancakes. Finely ground cornmeal was whisked with hot water and a pinch of salt, then spooned onto a greased skillet where it cooked to a golden brown. The edges crisped while the center stayed tender, creating a satisfying contrast in every bite. A pat of soft butter blended with golden honey melted over the warm cakes, adding sweetness that complemented the rustic corn flavor. Hoe cakes were beloved for their simplicity and speed, perfect for busy mornings or serving alongside eggs and greens. African-American cooks carried this tradition from farm kitchens to city apartments, showing how a few ingredients could become a breakfast favorite. Children loved them plain, while adults enjoyed the gentle sweetness of honey butter that pooled across the hot surface. Cornmeal hoe cakes with honey butter proved that the humblest grains could shine when cooked with skill, care, and a sense of history. If one of these breakfasts brought back a memory, tell me which one in the comments and tap like and subscribe so more lost traditions can find their way home.